less than 35 years. There is no electrolytic capacitors. There's no aging components in the tubes. And every component in there is incredibly precise. Every resistor, 1/4% tolerance. The capacitors are all Mylar film capacitors. They're 0.5% and 1/4% tolerances. They must be $10 capacitors. Just incredibly over-designed system. This is a close-up of their Vidicon tube, which is very similar to Gary's diagram. I included it just because I think it's beautiful industrial art. The picture tube was potted for safety reasons. The consumer could not hurt themselves in any way. You could drop that thing on the floor. You might bust the tube, but it's not going anywhere. This is a picture of the potting jig at the factory where they're potting the tubes. It appears that they're potting these things one at a time. The Picturephone also was the first product that they put out that used integrated circuits. And according to the articles in the magazine that covers this, my source, these are the most complex integrated circuits ever designed in the history of mankind. They have 76 transistors, and they amount to a 4-bit counter and a glue logic. And they used they combined them in pairs. So you had two 8-bit counters, one for the horizontal countdown and one for vertical countdown for line counting. And the 5th chip was the glue logic to decode the counts to produce the appropriate pulses. The future that never happened was the color picture phones. They were on the drawing board and prototypes were being made, but they never built any. And another dream that Bell Labs had for these was to add voice-operated conferencing, so they were hands-free. The testing with executives was that the executives did not like to have to reach down and adjust controls and fiddle with it in real time while they're having a conference. It distracts from the business at hand. The service never caught on until there was mass internet and advanced signal processing to really get the cost of transmitting the information over any distance. Their service was discontinued in '77, and no other video phone service as a standalone service was ever created again. AT&T was the only picture phone system in the world that wasn't designed to use standard definition from the get-go. I never found out why, but I guess they were trying to get 1 megahertz down the line, and 6 megahertz was just out, or 4 megahertz. Let me talk about my picture phone experience. Well, that's a dark picture. I managed to purchase 2 picture phones on eBay over the past few years, and I've had them sitting around, and I've been dying to fire them up, but I never got the 1A control unit or the switch. I could have lived without the switch. I contacted the Telephone Museum in Seattle, I believe, in Washington State, and managed to get the schematics for this, for the picture phone unit itself and the 1A power supply control unit. In fact, the entire system, the switch and everything, and decided to construct my own based on their schematics. I used modern technology. They had classic discrete transistor voltage regulators and simple things like that. I used IC regulators and managed to replicate the function of it. Here's my rough sketch of the 50-pin interface and what was required to connect it up. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but I want to point out that there is 2 bipolar power supplies, plus and minus 23 volts, plus and minus 17 volts. This is important to my story. I was working on this about a month and a half ago on my bench. This is my home constructed power supply. This is using modern breadboarding techniques. I had purchased almost custom-made transformers. I finally found a company that sold transformers with voltage changes in 2-volt steps through the series. So I was able to get something that was practical for me to make as close to a duplicate of their power supply as I could. And so what you can't see behind the 2 heat sinks is there are 3 capacitors. These are the screws on the top of the capacitors. And my first Picturephone, when I fired it up, I didn't include a picture of it malfunctioning here. It has some strange problem. It has vertical collapse when it's switched to loop back. When I try to view myself, the vertical scanning stops. I had the second Picturephone in storage. Took a couple of weeks to get around to pulling it out. And I brought it home, and I connected it up, and I had removed the capacitors, which are held on with screws, prior to that. So I reassembled the power supply board very quickly, too quickly. This capacitor is the plus 27 volts. This one over here is the minus 27 volts. Excuse me, yes, the 27 volts. There is a fine wire running under there, under the board, through that region from this positive terminal over to the connector, and and it passes right past the negative 23 volt screw. When I reassembled the power supply, I pinched that positive voltage wire under that negative voltage screw. And so I went to power it up. Oh, this is Picturephone 1. And I got ahead of myself here. Forgive me. And this was the scan failure I would get. However, you can see some bumpiness in here, and waving my hands in front of the camera proved there is video coming out. So I'm very close. I don't think I've done anything wrong. You saw how simple the interface was. So I dug the second one out of storage. I reassembled the power supply, as I said, and I bent down and plugged it in. I was video recording it at the time, but I'm too ashamed to show you the video. I'm sitting at my table, and my power strip is on the floor. I bend down, and I plug in the plug, and on the video, off the top of the power supply, you see the smoke. I don't know it yet. I sit up, and I look, screen's blank, of course, and I smell the smoke. And the reason I won't show the video is I actually cried for about 60 seconds. And to sum up, I had a really bad hair day. So recapping, I guess I misquoted the power lines, the 17 to the minus 17 and plus 17. What happened when the wire blew out, the positive 17 volt line going into the Picturephone now had minus 17 volts on it, and I blew every transistor in the Picturephone. So now I don't have 2 Picturephones to experiment with. I'm going to go back and troubleshoot the vertical collapse eventually and try to find out what's going on. And perhaps next year I can bring some working Picturephones to show.
How about eBay?
Yeah, well, okay, sure. It's in the power supply unit itself. And mine, I didn't put the fuses in my circuit. And so speaking of eBay, when I purchased my Picturephones on eBay, I paid $1,500 for the first one and $1,300 for the second one. About 4 months ago, there was 2 Picturephones, a 1A control unit, a power supply unit, and a switch unit bolted to a board as a set, and it sold for almost $1,000. So the price of these things is not going down, and I'm at a juncture where I'm not sure I want to sink any more money into it. So I'd appreciate your opinions on whether I should continue or cut my losses and run.
Make up a collection.
This thing, it must have well over 70 transistors, and it's all discrete, well, mostly discrete. You know, in fact, now that I think about it, if the ICs are damaged, it's done. That phone can never be repaired. It is a beautiful, beautiful display item. Thanks. Any other questions?
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. Well, I have to tell you, I learned in my old age today, and I think it's marvelous that we get the presentations that we do. So some of you think about next year and what you're going to present to us. And Jerome's going to bring in a couple of 15Gs for $25 a piece. uh, to look at it. Listen, we all need to be educated. This is really the end of our presentations. The silent auction is still on for about another hour over to the museum. Why don't you all go over and have a little fun, and thanks all for coming. Yeah.